Welcome back to A Rose Within the Thorns, the vodcast where we discover the beauty within powerful literature and explore how stories help us connect, reflect, and grow. Today we are turning to section 2 of Elie Wiesel's Night, a section that, while physically short, is psychologically massive. It captures the moment between freedom and full imprisonment. It's the moment the Jewish people are no longer just citizens under suspicion, but become prisoners heading into the unknown. Let's start with our summary. So the chapter begins with the train journey. Eliezer, his family, and around 80 others are forced into sealed cattle cars, with barely enough room to stand. There's no ventilation, no sanitation, and no comfort. People take turns sitting. The young try to distract themselves, the old whisper prayers. But the walls are closing in, literally and emotionally. Food and water are rationed, not because of logic, but because of fear. Everyone is trying to prepare for something worse, though they don't know what it is yet. At a stop near the Czechoslovakian border, a German officer boards the train and announces that the group is now under Nazi command. The doors are bolted shut. The world outside disappears. What's left is only heat, darkness, silence, and one woman's scream. Mrs. Schechter, traveling with her 10-year-old son, begins screaming about flames and a fire that no one else can see. At first, people try to calm her, but her visions grow louder, more frequent, and more desperate. Eventually, to silence her, the others tie her up and beat her. Her cries unsettle them more than the heat or the thirst. Even her young son, once clinging to her in panic, becomes silent. Then, arrival. The train stops at a place no one has heard of, Auschwitz. Two men bribe a guard and return with reassuring news. Families will stay together. Conditions aren't too bad, and people will work, not die. There's a flicker of hope. But as night falls and the train moves again, Mrs. Schachter screams once more. This time, the others run to the window, and this time they see it. Flames. A chimney belching fire into a black sky. The air reeks of burning flesh. Her screams were not madness, they were prophecy. And now the nightmare has begun. Birkenau. Wiesel deliberately represents this section not simply as a journey of bodies, but as a journey of cultural collapse. In the space of a few days, identities rooted in faith, family, and community are fractured by external control and internal fear. The cattle car becomes a symbolic landscape where traditional values like compassion, restraint, or solidarity are replaced with self-preservation and silence. The aesthetic choice to contain the entire chapter within the train intensifies this effect. Wiesel uses claustrophobic imagery, sensory overload, and oral repetition to create a suffocating emotional atmosphere. The limited setting amplifies the psychological unraveling and positions the audience not just observers but as witnesses to the moral corrosion of the oppressed. By placing prophetic voices like Mrs. Schachter and Moish the Beadle at the margins of belief, Wiesel invites readers to reflect on how cultural attitudes towards madness, trauma, and warning are shaped by convenience and fear. The audience is positioned to interrogate the line between insanity and vision, between helplessness and complicity. Let's have a look at some of our themes within this chapter. Our first is prophetic vision versus collective denial. So Mrs. Schachter serves as a second harbinger of horror, echoing Moish the Beadle from section 1. While Moyse tried to deliver a rational eyewitness account of the Nazi atrocities, Mrs. Schachter's warning comes in the form of emotional breakdown and hallucination. She screams about fire long before the flames of Birkenau come into view, yet no one listens. Her visions are dismissed because they are uncomfortable, irrational, and disruptive. The passengers choose to believe lies. We're just going to work. we'll be with our families, because denial is safer than confronting what might be true. Wiesel uses this moment to show that truth doesn't always arrive in calm or logical packages. Sometimes it comes screaming, but still we look away. Mrs. Schechter's cries foreshadow not only the literal fires of the crematorium, but also the internal breakdown of faith, logic, and hope. Our second sub theme is that of loss of humanity and compassion. The reaction of the passengers to Mrs. Schechter's suffering is a chilling study in how people quickly can lose their humanity. At first, they try to comfort her. Then, when the fear becomes too much, they tie her up. Eventually, they beat her with the approval from the crowd. Wiesel deliberately frames this transformation not as a choice but as a descent. The passengers don't become evil, they become desperate. Their instinct to protect themselves overrides their capacity for empathy. Even her son, who clings to her in the beginning, becomes silent and resigned. This theme exposes one of the memoir's hardest truths. Under extreme conditions, the victims of dehumanization may begin to dehumanize each other. The social contract unravels, kindness becomes a liability, and when suffering becomes unbearable, silence becomes the easiest response. Wiesel doesn't just ask us to judge the passengers, he asks us to recognize the warning. What happens to human decency when survival is the only goal? Our third sub theme is that of fear as a contagion. Wiesel presents fear not just as an emotion, but as an infectious force. It spreads through the train car like a virus. No one is immune, not the young lovers, not the religious elders, not even Eliezer. As the days pass, their world shrinks, their breath shortens, and their visions narrows. The sealed cattle car becomes a metaphor for psychological suffocation. It's not just the lack of air, it's the lack of escape, the lack of control, and the lack of knowledge. That sealed space becomes like a pressure cooker for paranoia and hysteria. Every scream feels like a threat. Every creak of the train reminds them of the abyss that they're moving toward. Fear consumes not just hope but reason. When they hear Mrs. Schechter again, they don't listen, they lash out. When they see Auschwitz for the first time, they dare to hope it might be better than whatever their minds had imagined. Fear here mirrors the flames. It's rising, it's uncontrollable and devouring. In this chapter, fear burns first before the fire outside ever does. I think that's a great moment for us to move into our last sub-theme, fire as a symbol. In Night, fire takes on a symbolic weight that lingers throughout the memoir, but this section is the first time it's introduced with full emotional force. Traditionally, in many religious texts, including Jewish scripture, fire is a symbol of divine presence, purification, or spiritual awakening. Think of Moses and the burning bush, or the fire of the temple altar. Fire represents God, but in Wiesel's world, fire has been stolen and corrupted. It no longer purifies, it annihilates. Mrs. Schachter's screaming about fire becomes a turning point. At first, the passengers dismiss it as madness, but when they arrive at Birkenau and see flames shooting from a chimney into the night sky, fire is transformed into something far more terrifying, a tool of industrialized death. The quote, "and as the train stopped, this time we saw flames rising from a tall chimney into a black sky." This line marks the shift. The fire isn't metaphorical anymore, it's literal. And it's burning the bodies of men, women, and children. From this point on, fire represents the ultimate erasure of identity, the destruction of not just life, but memory, family, and faith. What's especially haunting is that the fire appears before the violence does. Wiesel places the fire in the reader's and the character's mind so that by the time the physical suffering begins, the psychological horror is already lit. It also becomes a symbol of silenced warning. Mrs. Schachter saw it. She tried to tell them. The fire was always there. They just didn't want to believe it. Let's now closely analyze some powerful quotes from within section 2. Each line is crafted not only to describe, but to confront us, to ask what happens to people when they're pushed beyond fear. Our first quote: the world had become a hermetically sealed cattle car. Wiesel's use of metaphor here transforms the cattle car from a physical space into a symbolic world of oppression. The phrase hermetically sealed implies a total lack of escape, both literally as the air is cut off and metaphorically as the passengers are sealed off from humanity, hope, and truth. By comparing the world to a cattle car, Wiesel shows how the prisoner's entire existence has been reduced to containment, silence, and fear. Wiesel wants the reader to feel the psychological claustrophobia that defined this journey. He uses this image to foreshadow the spiritual death that begins long before the physical one. The world itself has been warped, and it begins inside this box. Fire. I see a fire. I see a fire. Wiesel's repetition of Mrs. Schachter's warning mimics both religious prophecy and psychological breakdown. The biblical rhythm in her words evokes the role of prophets in Scripture, those who see what others cannot. Yet the passengers ignore her, choosing delusion over discomfort. Ironically, her madness contains more truth than their reason. The repetition here builds a haunting urgency and hints at the flames of the crematorium. Wiesel wants us to confront the consequences of disbelief and denial. By framing truth as madness, he reveals how trauma distorts perception and how society silences those who speak uncomfortable truths. This moment also foreshadows the central symbol of fire and its horrific transformation. She looked like a withered tree in a field of wheat. Wiesel uses this simile to position Mrs. Schachter as a figure of isolation and fragility. The image of a withered tree surrounded by living wheat suggests that she is both out of place and already marked by death. It shows how her suffering isolates her, even within the suffering of the group. She stands out because she knows or feels what others aren't ready to face. Wiesel seeks to generate both pity and fear in the reader. This image connects physical and spiritual desolation. Mrs. Schachter becomes a visual metaphor for what happens when someone sees truth too soon. It breaks them, and no one wants to look. The heat, the thirst, the stench, the lack of air, yet all that was nothing compared to her screams. Through juxtaposition of physical suffering with emotional torment, Wiesel reveals how fear eclipses all other pain. The hyperbole, nothing compared to her screams, is not an exaggeration, but an emotional truth. Her voice is unbearable because it's forcing the others to confront what they fear. The piling of physical discomfort also mirrors the piling pressure inside the car and inside the minds of our characters. Wiesel is showing us that the psychological terror and the erosion of hope are more destructive than hunger or thirst. He's inviting us to reflect on what truly breaks a person, not the body, but the mind's slow collapse under fear and silence. We had believed her, if only for an instant. Wiesel creates situational irony here. After tying her up, mocking her, and physically assaulting her, the passengers momentarily believe that the woman they silenced. The shift in tone from dismissiveness to regret reflects how unstable their certainty is. This admission, small, quiet, almost hidden, reveals how doubt and dread have started to creep into even the most hopeful minds. Wiesel includes this line to expose the fragility of hope and the human tendency to delay belief until it's too late. This moment encourages readers to question the moral cost of ignoring inconvenient truths and to recognize how easily fear silences not only the speaker, but the listener. Jews, look at the fire, look at the flames. In this climactic line, Wiesel uses a direct address to break the wall between the character and the audience. Jews, look, becomes not only a plea to the people in the train car, but to us, the readers. The motif of fire returns in full force, no longer symbolic, but literal. The flames Mrs. Schachter cries about are now visible, and with them, the reality of the Holocaust becomes undeniable. Wiesel deliberately uses this moment as a turning point, the moment vision replaces denial, and reality extinguishes delusion. The repetition of look demands confrontation. He wants the audience to bear witness, just as he does, so the memory of these flames and what they represent will not be forgotten. The doors were nailed, the way back irrevocably cut off. Here, Wiesel uses the symbolism of the nailed doors to reflect a deeper emotional and existential reality. While literally describing the ceiling of the cattle car, the image symbolizes the final severing of the prisoners from their past lives, identity, and freedom. The phrase irrevocably cut off speaks not only of their physical journey, but to the spiritual one. There's no returning to the innocence, safety, or ignorance of before. The nailed doors become a symbol of fate, enclosing them now in a new world defined by confinement, helplessness, and dehumanization. No longer citizens, neighbors, or children. They are all passengers bound for destruction. There is no exit. Wiesel uses this moment to show that the Holocaust didn't just destroy bodies, it severed memory, belonging, and identity. The image of the sealed car forces readers to feel the finality of that transition. It also reinforces a key motif of entrapment, the world shrinking until there is nowhere left to go, physically or morally. We're now going to have a look at some of our reflective questions. So, as suggested previously, have a go answering these questions first, and then listen to my example response to see how close you were to answering that question. So, our first question: why do you think Wiesel included Mrs. Schachter's visions when no one believed her? Wiesel includes Mrs. Schachter's visions to construct a powerful representation of psychological collapse and prophetic truth, shaped by the trauma of displacement and separation. Her hallucinations reflect a fragmented identity, a mother who has lost her family, and with them, her grip on reality. Yet her cries offer a chilling truth. Sometimes madness is more truthful than reason. Through her, Wiesel explores how people respond to uncomfortable truths. The group ignores her not because her message is unbelievable, but because it's emotionally unbearable. This reflects the broader cultural attitude of denial and passivity that underpin the Holocaust's early stages. She becomes a symbol of silenced truth, and audiences are invited to consider how societies often suppress or ignore those who sound the alarm. Stylistically, Wiesel's repetition of fire, I see a fire, reinforces her role as a modern day prophet. Her vision positions her not just as a character, but as a warning, one that the reader is challenged to believe, even as those around her do not. This juxtaposition creates dramatic irony and positions the audience to be more critically alert to ignored voices. Our second question: How does fear begin to transform the group, even before they reach the camp? Wiesel uses the cattle car as a symbol of dehumanization, showing that without guards or fences, the loss of agency and certainty begins to corrode social bonds. As fear sets in, the group's collective identity as a community begins to dissolve. They are no longer neighbors or fellow citizens. They become survivors in waiting, each shrinking into self preservation. This transformation reflects a shift in cultural values, from shared faith and tradition to distrust and instinct. The group's descent into suspicion and silence mirrors the way oppressive systems rely on fear to dismantle empathy. It represents how Holocaust victims were not only stripped of external freedoms, but slowly reconditioned to abandon internal moral codes. Wiesel's use of aesthetic features, such as the claustrophobic imagery of the hermetically sealed cattle car and the harsh sensory detail of heat, thirst, and noise, emphasizes that oppression begins before arrival at the camp. The physical space becomes a symbolic one, a crucible where identity and decency are tested and often lost. Our third question: what did the passengers' reactions to Mrs. Shakhtar reveal about how humans respond to fear and helplessness? Well, the passengers' treatment of Mrs. Shakhtar reveals a confronting truth. When people are afraid and powerless, they often target the most vulnerable. Her screaming is not just irritating, it forces them to confront what they're trying to suppress. Instead of addressing their fear, they attempt to silence its source. Wiesel is representing a collective breakdown in ethical behavior, shaped by prolonged uncertainty and the erosion of cultural and spiritual norms. The fact that a group of deeply religious and formally communal people can turn violent against one of their own reflects the psychological cost of systemic oppression. The stylistic device of contrast is used to devastating effect. The group, once known for charity, scholarship, and tradition, is now shown gagging a woman and cheering her beating. Wiesel positions the audience to reflect on their own capacity for compassion and complicity, asking, what would you do in such a moment? The cultural value of community care, central to that of the Jewish tradition, is deliberately inverted here. The breakdown invites readers to consider how fragile moral frameworks are when survival is the only priority. Our fourth question: why do you think the passengers were more frightened by her screams than the conditions in the cattle car? While the physical conditions were horrifying, cramped space, the stifling heat, and dehydration, it was Mrs. Schacht's screams that truly unsettled the group. This is because her voice carried symbolic weight. It pierced the illusion that there was still hope. Her words were an affront to the coping mechanism of optimism. Wiesel is exploring the human need for denial in the face of terror. The passengers could endure thirst and heat because those are measurable physical sufferings. Her screams, however, represented the unknown, and in that unknown was death, loss, and spiritual collapse. Fear of the mind, Wiesel suggests, is greater than fear of the body. By using oral imagery and repetition, Wiesel elevates the emotional intensity of her cries. The persistent sound becomes a narrative device that drives the psychological arc of this section. Culturally, readers are invited to reflect on how society often punishes those who speak the truth when it threatens collective comfort. The time and place, a cramped cattle car heading towards the Holocaust, becomes that crucible of moral reckoning. Wiesel positions his audience to empathize with fear, but not excuse cruelty. And our last question: What symbolic role does fire play throughout this section? And how does it contrast with traditional use of fire in religious or cultural contexts? In section 2, fire emerges as one of the most potent symbols of corrupted meaning. Traditionally, fire in religious texts is associated with divine purification, enlightenment, or presence. For example, in Jewish tradition, fire appears in the burning bush or the eternal flame of the temple, symbols of hope, faith, and covenant. But in night, fire here becomes a tool of extermination. Wiesel reconfigures the reader's cultural expectations, taking something sacred and making it horrifying. The flames that once represented divine presence now signal absence, destruction, and the end of faith. Mrs. Schachter's visions of fire is not metaphorical. It becomes literal at Birkenau, where the chimneys spew smoke and the air reeks of burning flesh. This symbolism allows you to reflect on how the Holocaust turned every cultural and spiritual belief inside out. Wiesel's stylistic strategy is to slowly build this symbol across the chapter or the section through prophetic repetition, growing sensory detail, and delayed revelation. By the time the flames are seen, the audience, like the passengers, can no longer deny their meaning. The fire's role is to mark a temporal and moral shift from the old world of beliefs to the new world of atrocity. Wiesel wants readers to understand that the Holocaust was not only the murder of people, it was the murder of meaning. In section 2, we feel the first great fracture in the collective spirit. This isn't just a train ride, it's a journey into silence, into disbelief, into the burning truth that so many refuse to face. In our next episode, we'll explore what happens once the passengers leave the train and what they see when they finally walk into Birkenau. It's a section where the unimaginable becomes real. Until then, keep questioning, keep thinking, and most of all, keep reading. I'm Mr. Rose, and this is A Rose Within the Thorns.